Even for me, as I've learned more about just compulsive behavior, I'm like, oh my God, I have legitimately had obsessive compulsive tendencies more grand than I ever thought in my life, and probably still to this day. So maybe if we can kind of define and give examples of these different lanes,
Sure.
that'd be great.
Well, they each have different symptom profiles, but a lot of times the root causes are of the same source, right? And I think it may have been Carl Jung. Usually if there's a quote and you say it's Carl Jung, there's like a 50% chance you're right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I remember reading this quote that said, all mental illness is the avoidance of a deeper suffering. And that always hit home with me, because a lot of times, whether it was I was struggling with anxiety, if we start with anxiety, because that's, I would say, the most common across the board is the experience of anxiety. A lot of people say, I feel anxious. And one day I was just kind of like sitting with that. I'm like, is anxiety actually a feeling? Or is it the avoidance of feeling? And that's what I really came across, is anxiety is not a feeling. Anxiety is the attempt to avoid feeling.
Wow, that's good.
Right? So if you're feeling anxious, the experience of anxiety is basically when someone's experiencing anxiety, they're trying to jump outside of themselves. But you know the old saying, wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah.
So the anxiety is wherever you go, you're following yourself. So that attempt to jump outside of yourself and avoid a feeling that's right underneath the surface. It could be guilt. It could be shame. It could be fear. It could be sadness. It could be grief. But in reality, most mental health challenges are really how we try and avoid a feeling or emotion that feels uncomfortable. And if you take obsessive compulsive disorder, where people have, looping thoughts, intrusive thoughts, obsessive compulsive, like checking different patterns. We all know, I would say most of your listeners know kind of like the term emotion as energy in motion.
Yeah.
Right? So if you think about an emotion as energy moving through your body, and when you're healthy and grounded and in your body, you're feeling that energy. And it's moving through you just like food moves through your digestive system. You digest it, you metabolize it, and then you have a nice bowel movement and you kind of move it out of you. Emotions kind of work in the same way if you let them move freely. But what happens is a lot of times there's emotions that we don't want to feel. So what happens is that energy is no longer in motion. And we know from our science classes where we were taught that energy can never be created or destroyed, only transferred, right? So that energy that's no longer in motion in your body has to go somewhere else. So it usually goes through the mind. And that's where people have a lot of kind of looping thoughts, racing thoughts. They can't quiet their mind. It's because the mental activity is kind of like the release valve for the built up energy that you weren't feeling. So that energy was no longer in motion, but it has to go somewhere. It's almost like your body's the soda bottle that you shook up, and your mind, you pull the cap off, and there's the release valve. So most OCD is simply a release valve that's a result of a pressure buildup that was simply born out of the unwillingness to feel something. So that's really how I describe OCD, is it's really the release valve of that energetic windup. And the anxiety is also the avoidance of whatever that feeling is. So most people that have OCD experience anxiety. The two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all, in a nutshell, the avoidance of an experience inside of you that's uncomfortable, right? And the ego has this idea that if I feel this, there's a chance it's never going to leave. right? So
Yeah.
if I let this in, what if it never leaves? If I start feeling this, what if it never stops? This is why Buddha taught the law of impermanence. If this too shall pass, if whatever you're experiencing, it's impermanence. But the ego doesn't really know that. The ego doesn't realize that. So it's like, if I let this in, it's never going to leave. So let's avoid it at all costs. And now the anxiety, the OCD, all of that is very prevalent during that process.